The wind had been at my back all morning, but by late afternoon it turned cold and raw, clawing at the edges of my jacket. My legs were lead, my throat dry as chalk, and each mile marker on that lonely stretch of trail through the Adirondacks felt like an insult. I planned to reach a lean-to before dark, but the map lied about the grade. Those last few miles rose like the spine of a sleeping dragon, steep and slick from an earlier rain. The sun was sinking behind a wall of clouds, the air thick with that damp chill that promises a hard night. My pack straps had rubbed twin welts into my shoulders, and I was close to admitting the truth. I'd misjudged the day and wasn't going to make it. The thought of setting camp there, on that miserable slope, among wet pine needles and skeletal trees, turned my stomach. My fuel was nearly gone, my socks were soaked through, and I'd already eaten the last handful of trail mix. I pictured the night, lying awake in the cold, teeth chattering, trying to pretend the sound of wind wasn't something moving out there. For the first time in years of hiking, a flicker of real fear took root. I'd done everything right, or so I thought. But the wilderness doesn't bargain. Then, just as I rounded a bend where the trail widened briefly into a clearing, I caught a thin ribbon of smoke rising between the trees. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks. Exhaustion can conjure mirages in the woods as easily as heat on asphalt. But then I smelled it. Wood smoke, and something else. Meat sizzling, fat hitting hot iron. My heart gave a kick. I stumbled toward it, half running, half tripping over roots until the glow of a fire broke through the grey. There, tucked beneath a natural rock overhang, was a camp so tidy it could have been from a ranger manual. A large canvas tarp was stretched tight against the wind, a fire pit ringed with stones, a kettle steaming gently on the coals. A man sat beside it, grey-bearded and broad-shouldered, wearing a wool sweater that looked older than I was. He looked up as I entered the circle of light. Not startled, just amused. "Evening, friend," he said, voice as rough and steady as a riverbank. "You look like you've had a day of it." I must have looked worse than I thought, because before I could answer, he was already waving me closer. "Come on now, get near the fire. You're about 2 shades short of hypothermic." I dropped my pack and sank to my knees by the flames, feeling heat soak into my bones. Steam rose off my jacket, and the smell of whatever he was cooking nearly made me dizzy. "Deer stew," he said, catching my glance at the pot. "Got a bit extra if you're hungry." I nodded mutely, too tired for pride. He ladled out a portion into a tin bowl and handed it over. The first bite burned my tongue, but I didn't care. It tasted of salt and pepper and something deeper. The taste of sheer relief. He chuckled softly while I ate, the kind of low laugh that comes from a man who spent enough nights under open skies to know how bad they can get. The fire popped and hissed as he added a log, and sparks rose like fireflies disappearing into the dark. My hands shook a little as I held the bowl, partly from cold, partly from the sudden release of all that tension that had been building since noon. "Name's Walt," he said after a while. "Been wintering out here longer than I care to count. You're the first soul I've seen in 3 days." I swallowed another spoonful of stew, still too shy of my own exhaustion to speak much. "Didn't expect anyone this far up the ridge," I managed finally. "Figured I'd be sleeping in the mud tonight." Walt grinned, deep creases forming in the weathered lines of his face. "Mud's good for footprints, not for sleeping. You did right coming off the trail when you did. Wind's coming from the north now. You'd have froze solid if you'd gone another mile." He said it so matter-of-factly that I didn't doubt him. The man had that quiet authority the woods teach. No bluster, no boasting. Just knowledge earned from years of paying attention. His camp reflected the same. Everything had its place. His tarp was pitched tight at an angle that shed the wind perfectly. a small trench carved to guide runoff from the fire pit. His bedroll laid out on a thick mat of spruce boughs that smelled sweet and resinous. After I'd eaten, he handed me a dented metal cup filled with something that steamed faintly. "Tea," he said. "Mint and pine needles. Keeps the cold out." It was sharp and clean, like drinking the forest itself. I felt it chase warmth down to my fingertips. "Got a dry pair of socks in that pack of yours?" he asked. I shook my head. "Everything's soaked." Without a word, he rummaged in a canvas duffel and tossed me a wool pair, old but thick and neatly mended. "You'll give those back tomorrow if we cross paths again," he said. "Tonight they're yours." It was a small thing, yet in that moment, it felt like the greatest act of generosity I'd ever received. I changed into them near the fire, my wet ones steaming where I laid them on a nearby rock. The relief of dry feet, the fire's heat, and the steady murmur of Walt's quiet conversation, talk of weather, trails, and old seasons, worked together like a balm. Later, when the wind rose again, he gestured toward the overhang. "Plenty of room under here. Got a spare blanket too. We'll keep the fire fed till the weather breaks." I hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but he waved me off. Ain't no intrusion when the forest tries to take the warmth from a man. Sit close, eat well, and you'll see. Every night ends better with company. And for the first time that long, grueling day, I believed him. The world beyond the glow of that small fire seemed a little less merciless and a little more like home. The storm came not long after that. First a few scattered flakes that melted in the firelight, then a steady curtain of snow that thickened until the trees beyond our shelter vanished into white. The sound of it was soft but relentless, a whispering that filled the spaces between the crackle of burning wood. Walt tended the fire with practiced care, nudging embers, shifting logs, keeping the heat steady without letting the flames leap too high. Every movement was calm, deliberate, the sort that comes from years of knowing that panic has no place out here. I sat, wrapped in one of his wool blankets, the rough fibres scratchy but blessedly warm. My body was still recovering from the day, muscles twitching in protest, skin flushed from the sudden warmth. For a long while, neither of us said much. The woods were speaking enough. The pop of sap bursting from pine, the wind moaning through the rocks, and somewhere far off, the lonely cry of what might have been a fox. "You hike alone often?" Walt asked eventually, voice low. "Usually," I said, "sometimes with friends, but they all had plans this weekend. I figured I could handle one night solo. Guess the mountain had other ideas." He smiled at that, a glint of firelight catching in his eyes. "That's how it goes. These hills don't mean to be cruel, but they sure don't bend for pride. I've seen plenty of folks think a clear morning meant an easy day. Then the cold rolls in, the map don't make sense anymore, and next thing you know, they're praying for a bit of luck. Or a fool like me with a warm fire." I laughed quietly, though there was truth under the humour. "Guess I got lucky tonight." He shrugged. "Luck favours those who keep walking, even when it hurts." The snow piled higher outside, but under that overhang, the world felt suspended, just the two of us, a pocket of warmth in a vast, frozen silence. Walt reached behind him and pulled out a small tin, shaking it so that something rattled inside. "Jerky," he said, tossing it over. "Made from last fall's deer. Good stuff for the trail." I took a piece, chewed slowly, and felt strength seep back into me. It wasn't just the food, it was the company, the steady reassurance that someone out here still cared enough to share what they had. Walt told me about the seasons he'd spent working the backcountry, maintaining trails, helping lost hikers, sometimes spending weeks alone checking the water levels and wildlife reports. He spoke with affection, not loneliness. When the fire burned low, he stretched his legs toward it and leaned back. Tomorrow will be clear. Snow will stick for a day or two, but the air behind it's good hiking weather. I'll walk you down to the old logging road. It'll cut half a day off your route. I nodded, the thought of help a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. The last thing I remember before sleep took me was the sound of the wind shifting again, gentler now, and the sight of Walt's silhouette framed by the fire, steady, unbothered, a guardian carved from smoke and patience. When dawn came, it was the soft kind. No brilliant sunrise, no blaze of colour, just a pale, silver light seeping through the snow-laden branches. The storm had stopped sometime in the night, leaving the world hushed and still, blanketed in white so pure it looked untouched since the beginning of time. I sat up slowly, stiff but warm, the smell of fresh coffee already curling through the air. Walt was crouched by the coals, coaxing them back to life, steam rising from a blackened kettle perched above the rekindled flames. "Morning," he said with a grin that showed deep lines around his eyes. "You made it through in one piece. That's better than most who try to outwalk a storm their first season out." I chuckled weakly, rubbing my neck. I was close to giving up yesterday. Thought I'd end up frozen against a tree or trying to start a fire with wet tinder. He poured me a tin cup of coffee, strong, black, and smoky from the fire. "Ain't no shame in knowing your limit," he said. "The mountains will teach that lesson better than any man." We packed up slowly, no rush in his movements. He showed me how he folded his tarp tight enough to shed water, how he bound his bedding with rope so it wouldn't come loose, how to leave the ground beneath a shelter clean, as if no one had ever been there. "Leave it better than you found it," he said simply, brushing snow from the stone ring around the fire pit. Someday, another tired soul might need this spot, same as you did. As we set out, the trail was a soft white ribbon winding through the evergreens. Every branch sagged under snow, and our footsteps made the only sound in the quiet morning. Walt led with the sure stride of someone who knew every bend and hollow by heart. He pointed out fox tracks near a frozen stream, a fallen birch with a hollow that made a perfect windbreak, and the faint scar of the old logging road we were heading toward. "You know," he said as we walked, "when I was younger, I thought I had to conquer every mile, had to prove something to the mountain, to myself. But these days..." He paused, adjusting his pack strap. "These days, I figure it's not about conquering anything. It's about learning to listen." "Listen?" I asked. He nodded. "To the wind, the water, your own gut. The forest tells you what it needs if you're quiet enough. Most folks just don't wait long enough to hear it." We walked in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. The trail sloped downward, and through the trees I caught sight of the faint glint of the old road he'd promised. For the first time since yesterday morning, I felt light again, like the weight of cold and fear had melted off somewhere behind me, left to rest in the ashes of that campfire. Walt stopped where the trail met the road, stamping the snow from his boots. "You'll follow that east for about 4 miles, he said. "It'll drop you near the ranger station by the lake. Easy walking from here." I wanted to thank him, but words felt clumsy compared to what he'd given me. Still, I managed a quiet, "You probably saved my skin last night." He smiled, eyes crinkling. "Nah, you saved yourself when you kept walking. I just happened to have the stew." We stood there a moment longer, 2 travelers in a clearing, brushed with the softest snow. The sun was climbing behind the trees, melting the ice from the pine boughs so that it fell in faint musical drops. Walt shifted his pack higher on his shoulder, preparing to head back toward his solitary camp. "You'll make good time now," he said. "Keep to the road and stay on the sun side. If the clouds roll back in, find shelter before the wind picks up again." I nodded, committing every word to memory. Something about his tone reminded me of my grandfather. Steady, unhurried, full of that simple, unspoken kindness that doesn't draw attention to itself. "I'll remember," I told him. He gave a short nod and turned back up the slope, his figure blending into the white woods until only his tracks remained. For a long while, I just stood there, the quiet pressing close, the air tasting sharp and clean. Then I took a deep breath, adjusted my own pack, and started down the road. My legs were stiff, but they moved easily now, guided by warmth instead of desperation. The landscape was transformed. Every branch shimmered with a thin glaze of ice. The world looked scrubbed new, like the storm had wiped away not only the night, but all the weariness that had come before it. I caught myself smiling, feeling that steady gratitude that hums in the chest after surviving something hard. Each step forward felt lighter, the sound of my boots crisp against the packed snow. By late morning, I reached the edge of the lake. The ranger station was just visible on the far shore, smoke rising from its chimney. But before heading that way, I stopped and looked back toward the hills. Somewhere up there, beneath a rock overhang I'd never find again, an old man was probably stirring his fire, maybe boiling water for tea, waiting out another quiet day in the backcountry. I thought about what he'd said, that the mountains teach humility better than pride ever could. The truth of it settled deep inside me. I'd set out that weekend chasing solitude, trying to prove something to myself. Instead, I'd found grace, in the form of a stranger with a steady fire and enough stew for two. At the ranger station, the warmth hit me like a wave, but I found myself lingering by the window, watching snow drift off the lake. I signed the register, leaving a small note beside my name. Found shelter with a man named Walt on the North Ridge. If you see him, tell him thank you, from the hiker who nearly froze. That night, lying safe and dry in my tent near the lake, I listened to the wind move gently through the pines and thought about how thin the line is between despair and hope. Sometimes it's just a few hundred steps more. Sometimes it's the smell of wood smoke in the distance. And sometimes it's a stranger's hand reaching out in the dark, reminding you that the trail may be wild, but it's never without kindness.